Hello historians, and welcome to another Purple Shirt History. In this video, we'll talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction in the United States. This video is meant for the Cambridge AS syllabus, but it should be useful for whatever exam board you take. Before we begin, if you could just take 2 seconds to like and subscribe so other students all over the world can find this video as well, I'd really appreciate it. Now, sit back, relax, grab a drink and your notebook, and let's learn about the American Civil War and Reconstruction.
The Civil War starts in 1861 with the attack on Fort Sumter. Here in the picture we see one of the most famous generals, William Tecumseh Sherman. The last Civil War book I read was about him. It was his biography. Very interesting. I can put a link in the description if you want to read about him and his life. The period after the war, from 1865 to 1877, is known as Reconstruction. What is Reconstruction? It is the attempt to bring the Union back together, to reincorporate the southern states that left and join the Confederacy, and to heal the wounds of the Civil War. The most common question about Reconstruction is, was Reconstruction a success or failure? American historians generally say Reconstruction was a failure due to the fact that the southern states reinstituted a lot of the practices of the Confederacy, and the North, despite winning the war, actually lost the narrative. The American Civil War is often looked at from the point of view of the Confederacy. They were very keen to change the narrative of the Civil War from plantation slavery way of life to states' rights and other things that were a lot more palatable to the people who fought for the Confederacy. So we'll talk about that later. The denigration of President Ulysses S. Grant because he was the commander of the Union armies. He was painted as incompetent, as a drunk, as corrupt. His administration had a lot of problems, but the kind of ad hominem attacks on him were very shrill. Another book that I want to recommend, there's a million great Civil War books. Stop whatever you can even stop this video and watch the Ken Burns' The Civil War is an absolute required watch if you want to know anything about the Civil War. When I was a kid, I watched that on PBS, which is the public broadcaster in America. I don't know how many times. So why did the Civil War last 4 years? There are changing military strategies. We see military tactics that transition from the kind of Napoleonic style, horses and cavalry charges, to, by the end of the Civil War, we see trench warfare, which is going to continue on to World War I and will be the first kind of 20th century style of warfare, also used in the Russo-Japanese War. So from going to kind of a Napoleonic style to a more modern style up until World War II, and mobility of tanks and things like that will render that obsolete. So it is a changing, dynamic battlefield in the American Civil War. Changing approaches of political and military leadership. The North has a very difficult time finding a general that is going to do things effectively. They go through a lot of commanders, and they finally do settle on Ulysses S. Grant. But there are a number of commanders before him, most notably George McClellan. You need to know him. He's a very good person for marching and maintaining supplies and stuff, but he doesn't actually attack the South. Even when he has numerical superiority and materiel superiority, he's very hesitant. So that's the main knock on him. And Abraham Lincoln was very frustrated with him. He said, General McClellan has a fine army. I wish he would use it. That was the northern aspect. A lot of hesitation, despite the overwhelming advantages the North had. On the southern side, the only real advantage the South had was very strong leadership. So Robert E. Lee was a West Point graduate who was very highly skilled in maneuverability and tactics like that. There was also a number of other great generals. Stonewall Jackson is someone you should know. Bedford Forrest, who is also going to be important in Reconstruction because he was a Southern leader in the Confederacy that eventually forms the Ku Klux Klan. But he was a very terrifying soldier because of his recklessness. He had a number of horses shot out from under him. Despite not being really trained in military tactics, he was an effective fighter. You have to give him that. And he was related to Forrest Gump. Resources available. This is completely lopsided in the favor of the North. There's about 27 million people in the North and about 9 million people in the South, including slaves, who really wouldn't be that keen on fighting to preserve slavery. So a three to one advantage about for the North. All the railroads in the North dwarf that in the South. So logistics, resupply, movement of troops, all those types of things are much easier for the North. And the industrial base. The North can crank out weapons at will, whereas the South does not have an industrial base to produce cannons and guns, bullets, and all the things you need to fight a war. So if you get any question about what were the advantages and disadvantages of the North and South in the Civil War, overwhelmingly lopsided that the North has more resources in men, in material, in everything. Impact of foreign influences, Britain and France. Well, let's start with Britain. They may not be terribly invested in the Civil War, but the South winning would weaken the United States. They couldn't directly aid the South. The North put a blockade around the Confederacy, so it choked off the exports, the cotton that was being shipped to Britain, just put a stranglehold on the Southern economy. The British were not happy with that because they needed that cotton to keep their mills running in the north of England in places like Manchester. So they were primarily concerned about keeping textile mills in operation. You can listen to a podcast on the Great Manchester Cotton Famine from In Our Time. I'll put another link. I'm going to put a lot of links in this video, so I need to do that more. So that'll be on there. Primarily the political and economic factors had to be finely balanced. Britain and France could not risk helping the South without infuriating the North. Passions were inflamed in the North, and as the North was already on war footing, people were thinking if the British helped the South at all, we should declare war on them. Lincoln, being very calm, collective, and cool-headed, said one war at a time. That could have spiraled out of control if it were not for Lincoln and his sober assessment of the situation. So to sum this slide up, why did it last 4 years? It was a combination of Northern hesitancy, some good initial victories because of the leadership of the Confederacy, and external factors that had to be taken into account. So a conflict that probably could have ended in a year or two dragged out significantly, and the way the North won in the end was by a war of attrition. The North could easily replace men and material, whereas the South, once they lost men or any strongholds, they were gone forever. And that eventually crippled the South and forced them to surrender. How significant was the immediate impact of the Civil War? Limitations on civil liberties during the war. So Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. Habeas corpus means you can't be arrested for no reason, basically. There was a lot of espionage going on in the North. We said that's where the industrial base is, so acts of sabotage against Northern war facilities was a common thing. So we look at Lincoln as being a person who wanted to defend the Union and its liberties, but in the short term, he did suspend habeas corpus and other things that were seen as fundamental rights. At the time, it was very controversial, and it's something that you need to look into more. So there were restrictions on freedom during the war. Reasons and responses to the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. The original rationale for the Civil War was to preserve the Union. But then it slowly begins to morph into the cause of slavery to gain some moral high ground for the North. The Emancipation Proclamation was something the abolitionists really wanted and gave Lincoln more political support from many quarters in the North. It didn't mean a lot at the time because if you were in Confederate-held territory, this wouldn't apply to you. The North had to win and abolish slavery in order to make it actually stick. So the Emancipation Proclamation, reasons and responses, look at both sides, the political reasons and then the actual social effect it had, being limited in the near term, but in the long term, it is quite significant. Juneteenth is the latest federal holiday in America. It is to commemorate the ending of slavery in the US. It's June 19th, I believe, is the date each year. So you can look that up and see the history of Juneteenth. That's not until 1865, but it's a new federal holiday, and it is something that is a commemoration of finally ending slavery in the United States. Life in the Confederate States, including the response of slaves. I haven't seen many questions on this in particular, so I think this is something that is more a paragraph for the questions. Let's just go over it briefly. What was life like? Well, the white men in the Confederacy were being conscripted into the Confederate Army. The Army of Northern Virginia is the best army the Confederacy has, and that's the one that is led by Robert E. Lee. So Virginia is the strongest state in the Confederacy. It's where the capital is, Richmond. As the men go off to war, slaves were able to see the opportunity. There's a lot less people around, and a lot more slaves escaped to the north, and a lot of them eventually joined the Union Army. Looking at the life in the Confederacy, we see the python-like grip of blockade, and then the subsequent cutting off of the Mississippi River. One of Grant's biggest successes is the Siege of Vicksburg, which chokes the Mississippi River off. So the Union can control the Mississippi. They control all the ports around the Confederacy. Towards the end of the war, the North is advancing deep into Southern territory. Now would be a good time to talk about Sherman's March to the Sea. There is just a grinding attritional warfare and the destruction of Southern infrastructure. In 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman leads an expedition towards Atlanta, Georgia, which was a giant railroad junction. He will go to Atlanta and burn it to the ground, essentially. The objective was to, quote, make Georgia howl. They destroy the railroad by heating up the rails and tying them into knots. Any military supplies are looted and then the rest burned. Anything that couldn't be carried away is burned. After Georgia, Sherman and his army move up to South Carolina, where this whole rebellion started, and they lay waste to Columbia, cities in South Carolina. This leaves a lot of the cities in the Confederacy in ruins. It is just a matter of time before the North will force a capitulation of the South. The nature of democracy in the North and South. First things first, women can't vote in North and South, so that's half the population out of the way. Of course, slaves can't vote in the South. Democracy in the North is still ongoing. There is a presidential election in 1864, and the biggest danger to the North not meeting its objectives of reunifying the country would be for Lincoln to lose and for someone like George McClellan to essentially sign a treaty with the South that lets them form their own country. That would have been a disaster for the strength and prestige of the United States. And that's what the South exactly was hoping for, Lincoln's political defeat and some kind of negotiated settlement where they would secede from the Union, keep slavery, and there would be two separate countries. With Sherman's victories in Atlanta and Grant having successes as well, it seems like the tide is turning in the Northern favor before the election of 1864. So Lincoln does win re-election and is able to prosecute the war. What were the aims and outcomes of Reconstruction? Presidential Reconstruction, Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated shortly after the end of the Civil War by John Wilkes Booth and replaced by his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is considered one of the worst presidents, if not the worst president in the history of the United States. He was impeached. He was very sympathetic to the South. He was very unpopular with a lot of the abolitionists, didn't have a lot of sympathy for the freedmen, which were the former slaves. He broke with the Republicans in 1866, and the radical Republicans really did not like him. So after the great leadership of Lincoln, Johnson was just trying to get things back to the pre-Civil War status quo, essentially, and that was not in the interest of many groups of people, leading to his lack of popularity. Radical Reconstruction from Congress and reasons for and passage of constitutional amendments 13th, 14th, and 15th. Before we get into the three amendments, know the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So this is the first Civil Rights Act, and the radical Republicans were pretty instrumental in getting this passed. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. 14th Amendment grants citizenship to everybody born in America, which the slaves were. And the 15th Amendment grants the right to vote. You can see in that picture that the South was broken into military districts, so there were Northern commanders responsible for individual districts that were made up of some ex-Confederate states. After the war, the white Southerners wanted to reestablish the social hierarchy that existed before the Civil War. So we start to see almost immediately after the Civil War, groups like the Ku Klux Klan which is a terrorist group that has the aim of preventing African Americans from participating in politics and society. The changing position of ex-slaves in the South is going to be a major part of Reconstruction, and eventually it's going to be ended in 1877 by the new president, Rutherford B. Hayes. So why is the position that Reconstruction failed so popular? It's a great case study in how American politics work and the deal-making and short-term nature of American politics, trying to get elected and having one administration counteract the policies of the previous one. Rutherford B. Hayes makes a deal with the Southern politicians to stop supporting Reconstruction and end it and leave them to their own devices. This compromise of 1877 is also known as the corrupt bargain. It effectively lets Southern Democrats, who call themselves Redeemer Democrats, dominate politics in the South again, and they quickly strip African Americans of rights. We start to see things like Jim Crow laws. Some examples of Jim Crow laws were poll taxes, literacy tests in order to vote. Poor illiterate whites were allowed to vote through exemptions called grandfather clauses, meaning if your grandfather could vote, you could too. So there was a complex web of laws that were put into place after the end of Reconstruction. These laws lasted until the next Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. So it was incredibly consequential, the failure of Reconstruction and the corrupt bargain, as well as the actions of Rutherford B. Hayes with the Southern Democrats. To summarize, first point, the military course of the war. The overwhelming advantage was with the North, but due to early Southern successes, the war dragged on for many years. It was the bloodiest war still, as of this recording date, in 2024, the bloodiest war in American history because everybody who died was an American, or more than any other war, more than World War II. It was only finally with a change of mindset and tactics that Grant and Sherman were able to break the Confederacy through slow attritional warfare. The Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect January 1st, 1863. At the time, it didn't affect all slaves because many were still under Confederate control, but in the long term, it had a massive impact. It stated that by executive order, slavery would be banned in the U.S., and after the war, it was codified into the Constitution with the 13th Amendment. However, Reconstruction largely failed to change the society in the South. Through segregation, Jim Crow laws, other levers, they impose a racial hierarchy with themselves at the top. The lost cause myth of the South engaging in some heroic states' rights uprising and rebellion. The lost cause is after the fact construction to hide the real reasons for the Confederacy. The real reason the South seceded was they wanted plantation slavery to be their economic and social system.